welcome to part 2 of this particular lesson. Of course, we're looking at project management framework. So this was where we left in part 1. Under the part 1, we took a look at the fact that in PMI's project management methodology, there are 49 processes. And then these 49 processes are grouped into what we refer to as the 5 process groups, as well as the 10 knowledge areas. And we'll say that the 10 knowledge areas is the core groups, which is the integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communication, risk, procurement, and then also stakeholders. So taking a look at each of the process groups one after the other, talking about the initiating process group. So don't forget, remember I told you that the initiating process group is basically where we have all the activities or all the processes that will enable us to kickstart the project. And that's what happens during the initiating process group. So this is where we define the new project or phase by establishing the vision of the project as well as the project outcomes. The project is also officially authorized during the initiating stage. This is also when the project charter is approved by the sponsor, and then also it also involves identifying as well as analyzing our stakeholders in order for us to align their expectations about the project. So all of these are part of the things that happen during the initiating stage of the project. So essentially, it marks the start of the project. It also marks where we authorize the project, which is basically what happens with the project charter. And then also part of the things we do there would include our stakeholder identification as well as analyzing our stakeholders. So the things we need to effectively initiate our project, that's what we refer to as input into initiating our project. They would include what we refer to as the project scope, the project statement of work, which is what we refer to as the SOW. So the SOW is the high-level narrative description of the work of the project. That's what the SOW captures. So don't forget that the SOW is developed before the project, which is what we refer to as pre-project. We're going to take a look at how this works out in the next lesson when we begin to talk about project integration management. Then other inputs that go into the initiating, process groups would include agreements. For example, you want to understand subcontractor agreements or already existing agreements that the organization may already have. And then also you talk about the business case. So the business case is the document that gives us a justification for the project in the first place. So this business case, of course, will form input into our initiation processes. And then also the enterprise environmental factors, which basically refers to factors that are not within our control. And then also organizational process assets. So organizational process assets simply refers to anything of value owned by the organization that can aid us in the course of the performance of the project. And then, of course, other procurement documents. So these are specific set of inputs that you're going to see as part of the inputs that we're going to be needing in the initiating process group processes. So the activities or actions that we actually carry out during the initiating, in other words, what exactly do we really do during the initiating process group? So this is where we perform project assessment with key stakeholders using available as well as historical data to see the feasibility of new products or services, considering assumptions and constraints, and then also identify key deliverables to achieve the project goals. We also perform stakeholder analysis here in order to align the expectations of our stakeholders and then gain their support for the project. This is also where we identify high-level risk using current and past data to propose implementation strategy, and then also participate in project charter development to ensure stakeholders' agreement. We also obtain project charter approval to gain authority and commitment, and then we'll perform benefit analysis to align organizational strategy and business value, and then of course we'll facilitate stakeholder communication about the elements of the project charter. So typically look at it from this particular perspective, that we have what we refer to as pre-project activities. Projects are typically undertaken either to solve a business need. And when we talk about the business need can either be that we are solving a problem or we are taking advantage of an opportunity. So when we mention input into the processes that we have in the initiating process group, all of these documents that we develop pre-project are part of the things you're going to be seeing as input into the processes that you see under initiating. So once we've been able to establish the need for the project, typically one of the key things we do first is to do what we refer to as a business case. So the business case is basically to be able to determine if it actually makes business sense to address this need. So that's why we say that the business case is where we get the justification for the project. That's exactly what happens with the business case. So once you've been able to develop the business case, some organizations go ahead to develop what we call a BMP if this is not already captured in the business case. So the BMP is basically known as the benefit management plan. And just like the name sounds, the benefit management plan would capture the benefit that the project is expected to deliver. So once the benefit management plan has been developed, then usually we have what we now refer to as the solution options. So the solution options are now basically the various ways we can address this business need. And then once the solution options have been developed, then usually we carry out what we refer to as feasibility. So the feasibility would help us to clearly understand which of these options will best address the need that we have established in this case. And then after we have done the feasibility, we now do what we refer to as selection. Selection is where we now determine, okay, that this is going to be the best option to implement, or this is going to be the best solution to implement. So once we've done the selection, then of course, we now draw up what we refer to as our SOW, which is the project statement of work. So the project statement of work will now capture, like I mentioned earlier on, the high-level narrative description of the work, in other words, of the solution that has been selected. So the high-level narrative description of the product is now what is captured in the SOW. All of these typically is within the purview of the business analyst. If you take a look at the other lesson that I also have on this particular platform, you notice that I clearly talked about business analysis there, especially for those who are preparing for the CBAP certification exam. And this is where we taught exactly what we do in the course of business analysis. So once the solution has been proffered, which is typically what the business analysts do. So if you notice, all of these things took place pre-project, before the project. Then this is where the project manager now comes in to make this a reality. So in order to make this SOW, which is this narrative description, a reality, then of course that's exactly what kickstarts the project, and that's where initiating now comes into place. So to be able to deliver this, we now appoint a project manager. And the document we use in appointing the project manager is what we now refer to as the project charter. So the project charter is a document that will now formally appoint the project manager and say, hey, we're going to be developing this particular solution. We have been able to draw up the statement of work. We now want you to make it a reality. So the project manager is basically the person who makes what is real to become reality. In other words, to manifest that which is captured with a narrative description. So remember, we talk about developing the charter. And then, of course, after that, the project manager will now do what we refer to as the stakeholder identification, which, of course, will now to a large extent mark the initiating of the project. So once that has been done, then the next thing is the project manager goes into planning, where he now determines the how much, the when that this particular project will be accomplished. Then, of course, after the planning, don't forget, we have the executing. So this is where the project work is now being done. And once we've been able to deliver all the deliverables, then we commence the closing process. Don't forget that our monitoring and controlling cuts across all of these process groups, as it were. And then, of course, as we move from initiating to closing, notice that time elapses. And then also, as we move from initiating to executing, also you notice that cost also rises, and cost is usually highest during the executing of the project. So many of the things or activities that you can see in the previous slide that we perform during the initiating, that's exactly what we have identified here. Of course, including project assessment to do the business case, then identifying high level risk, participating in development of the charter, Then also benefit analysis, also stakeholder communication. So at the end of the day, we have what we call the business case, then of course the project statement of work, the EEF, as well as the OPA, and then other procurement documents as well as agreements that will now form input into the processes that we carry out during the initiating process group. So once we're done with the initiating, remember I made mention of the fact that we now go into planning, and I said that this is where we establish the scope of effort, objectives, the course of action required to obtain the objectives. So this is clearly where we define the how much, and then also the when that it will take us to carry out this project. So part of the things that will form input in our planning process group would include the project charter, which of course has been developed during the initiating. So we're not going to be referencing it when we're creating the plan. And then also, we're not going to put into consideration all the further requirements that we gather from customers as well as from our stakeholders. And then also, we also want to determine our stakeholder management strategy, which was part of the things we got when we did stakeholder identification during the initiating. Then, of course, our organizational process asset, which refers to previous project documents. In this case, they include assets, things of value owned by the organization that can aid in the planning. Then enterprise environmental factors, factors that we need to put into consideration that are not, within our control. Also, team agreement as well as resource calendars. These are things that we are going to see as part of the input during the planning processes. And then part of the actions or things we do during the planning process would include refining the requirements and then convert them into scope statement as well as the work breakdown structure. If you followed our analysis, you notice that part of the things that we developed during the initiating was the statement of work, which is the SOW. And I mentioned that the SOW gives us a high-level narrative description of the work of the project itself. So this high-level narrative description is now refined further to now give us what we refer to as the project scope statement, which is now a much more detailed description of the product that the project would accomplish, and this would be done during the planning of the project. And this project scope statement, or the scope that we have defined, will now further be broken down into what we call the work breakdown structure. Well, some of these terms might begin to appear strange to you, but not to worry. We're going to go through all of this in the course of this training. So I suggest you watch these videos at least 2 times so that when you come back to this again, it will make more sense to you. Part of the things we also do in the planning is to get the stakeholder approval and buy-in, then develop the baselines, including the cost, the scope, the schedule baseline. So remember, I keep mentioning that part of what we do in the planning is to determine the how, which is basically what we talk about when we talk about the scope. Then we'll talk about the how much, that's what the cost addresses. And then we'll talk about the when, that is exactly what the schedule addresses. And then also, we clearly define the roles and responsibilities of our project team, and then determine project quality standards, and then also prepare the framework for risk management, because this is also part of what we're going to be doing in the course of the planning, identifying our risk, and then also analyzing the risk and coming up with the relevant risk response. Then determine the need to be purchased, and then of course also document the project plan and then handle updates to the plan arising out of change requests. All of these and many more are part of the activities that typically happen during the planning process group. Then during the executing, now this is exactly where we now begin to carry out the work of the project as captured in the project management plan to enable us meet the project specifications. So no wonder the project management plan will form an input here, because the project management plan is the reference document for executing. Then our resource calendars, which of course shows the availability and dates that our resources will work. Other project documents, say for example designs, use cases, test cases, all of these would also form input during the executing process group. And then of course you also have the enterprise environmental factors. Then don't also forget that your seller proposals, because it is now time for us to begin to purchase. So all of those proposals will now form an integral part of this executing process group. Then also change requests will also form, approved change request would also form input here, because once we have a change, once there is a need for a change and it goes through an approval process, and then of course if at all it is approved, we now need to come back again and implement it, and that's part of the reason why you're seeing approved change request here. Also, we'll talk about quality control measures, your make or buy decisions, which is the output you get after you actually plan your procurement. So this determines whether you're going to buy or you're going to make certain items you'll be needing in your project. Then your source selection criteria, which is also a byproduct of the planned procurement process, where you basically determine the source of the, how you're going to be selecting vendors who are going to be providing specific artifacts or items that you need in the project. Then your work performance report, as well as your work performance information. All of these are input in the executing process. So some of the actions that we take during the executing would include: 1, to manage stakeholder engagement, and then also deliver the work packages as planned, then implement quality assurance activities, also produce project reports, and then also remove project bottlenecks by organizing team building activities, also organizing training for team members, and then of course conducting project progress, as well as implement approved changes. These and many more are part of the actions or activities that are usually performed during the executing of the project. So in a nutshell, execution is basically where the action begins, and then of course we now begin to carry out the project implementation. So during the monitoring and controlling, this is where we check that, like I mentioned earlier on. So that's where we track, we review, we regulate the progress of the performance of the project. In other words, we're now comparing the actual against the planned to be able to determine if there is a variance, and then this will now help us to determine the next line of action or what we need to do in order to bring our project back in line, and then also to determine the status of our project at every point in time, which is the reason why input in the monitoring and controlling would include your deliverables, because these deliverables represent the actuals, and then also your work performance data, which are raw facts that you gather in the course of the implementation of your project. Now, these raw facts as well as deliverables will now be compared with the content of the project management plan, and that's essentially what I mean by actual versus plan, to now be able to give us the status and then also determine if there are variances within the project. Then also don't forget, we have what we refer to as change request, because change request is one major input in the monitoring and controlling process group, because as the project is being implemented, we're going to notice that when we check, we might need to carry out certain changes in the way we have been doing certain things, and that's part of the reason why you're seeing change requests here. So part of the actions that we perform during the monitoring and controlling would include to measure project performance against baseline, that's actual versus plan, then determine variances, and then take appropriate actions. And that's basically what we'll talk here, what we said here, determine if there are variances and then how to correct the variance. Then recommend changes as well as corrective and preventive actions. When we talk about corrective actions simply means we determine the root cause of those variances, and then we take appropriate actions in order to prevent it from happening again. That's what we refer to as corrective action. So corrective action is basically to prevent an error from happening again. While preventive action now talks about, okay, is there a way we can stop it from happening at all? Maybe in subsequent phases, or even if not necessary that it has happened in our project, maybe we learned about this from other projects. Then we now take relevant steps to ensure that it doesn't happen in our own project. That's what we refer to as preventive actions. Then also, part of the activities you perform here would include you facilitate conflict resolution, identify the root causes of problem, also control changes, and then conduct status review meetings. These are some of the activities that take place during the monitoring and controlling process group. Now, the closing process group is where we now finalize the activities across all management process groups. In other words, we formally complete the project or the phase of the project, and then of course make sure that we have brought the project to an end. So input would include the plan, that's the project management plan, as well as other project documents. Of course, we need them during the closing, because that's now going to be our reference point to be able to determine if we've been able to fulfill all the deliverables as captured in the plan, as well as the relevant documents. Then also your accepted project deliverables, including your procurement document, then also your organizational process process assets, as well as your enterprise environmental factors. So part of the actions that we perform during the closing process group would include to confirm that all project requirements are met, and then also obtain formal sign-off from the customer, then make payment for all parties, as well as update cost records, also complete contract closure, update lessons learned database, measure customer satisfaction, and then hand over project deliverables to operations team, and then also release resources from the project. So these are some of the actions that usually happen or take place during the closing process group. So here we took a look at the 5 process groups in detail, which of course are initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. We also took a look at the 10 knowledge areas on a high level, which are integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communication, risk, procurement, and stakeholders. So we have a task here. It says list the 5 process groups and provide a brief explanation on each. Also do same for the 10 knowledge areas. List the 10 knowledge areas and provide brief explanation on each. So you can pause this video and then perform that particular task. So far, so good. So from what we have been saying so far, notice that we mentioned earlier on that typically we have what we refer to as the project life cycle. And we say that the project life cycle is breaking down the project into what we refer to as phases. So the phase of a project simply represents a stage in the project. That's exactly what the phase refers to. So you can see from the diagram here, each of these components represents a phase of the project. So for this particular project, the project life cycle now includes the starting the project, which is a phase, then organizing and preparing, which is also another phase, carrying out the project itself, which is also another phase, and then ending the project. So these are, basically how this particular project has been broken down into. So at the end of every phase, you're going to see decision points. So these decision points are what we now refer to as phase gate. So phase gate is basically where we carry out a review at the end of a phase of the project and then take a decision whether to continue to the next phase or to initiate what we now refer to as premature closure. So part of the things we do during the phase gate is what we refer to as the CBJ. That's the continuous business justification. In other words, we're asking ourselves, does it still make sense for us to proceed with this particular project? Don't forget, it is not all projects that you must typically bring to a final conclusion. Sometimes, like we mentioned earlier on, there are certain things that can give rise to the abrupt end or completion of a project. Say, for example, that particular need has already been met by another solution, or you may also have a situation where the justification for that particular project doesn't exist any longer, maybe because of changing technology or because of certain things that may have happened. All of these are part of the things you need to put into consideration during your phase gate. I was part of a particular training for an organization, and then this is a telecom firm, a very huge telecommunications firm. And then in the course of the training, I noticed that the senior management were complaining to me about how they've developed a couple of products in the past, and then when they finished developing the products, they discovered that the need for the product has been eroded, and then they have a series of those products that they keep asking themselves, why did we even develop them in the first place? So I told them to ensure that in the course of carrying out the project that they have at least 2 management stages, and then of course they should also carry out what we now refer to as phase gate, which is where they will do the continuous business justification to determine if it still makes business sense to proceed with the project or not. All of these are part of the things we do during the phase gate. And then don't also forget we have the process groups. So these are the 5 process groups, which are the initiating, planning, executing, the monitoring and controlling, as well as the closing. So sometimes you may have a project where each of these process group is performed at each of these stages of the project. So that's exactly what you're seeing here. So we initiate and then plan, then execute, check, and then close the starting project. Then we move to the next phase, which is organizing and planning. We also initiate it, plan it, execute it, monitor and control, and close in that particular order. And then don't also forget, like I mentioned earlier on, that the 10 knowledge areas simply represent the basis. In other words, the knowledge, supporting knowledge that you need to have to be able to implement your project effectively. And that's why you're seeing the 10 knowledge areas as the foundation of all of these things that we have mentioned earlier on. So they will identify the areas of the project that needs to be managed effectively in order to enable us to achieve the project's result. That's exactly what the knowledge areas focus on. So this is typically how the process groups interact. So you notice that part of the very first process group that we have that starts in the project is the initiating process group. And then of course at a point in time in the course of the initiating, you will notice that planning will begin. So that's why you're seeing the planning curve here, and this is what you're seeing here with the planning curve. And then while planning is going on, you may now notice that the monitoring and controlling cuts across all of these other process groups, like we mentioned earlier on, because we monitor and control across all process groups. And then beyond that, also notice that we now have the executing. That's this other dotted line that you're seeing here, which is the executing process group. And you can see the executing is where the cost is usually highest, and it starts at a point in time after planning has started, and that's what happens in the course of the executing. And then while that is going on, when we have effectively carried out or delivered the project, it starts triggering. So the moment we begin to deliver the deliverables in the course of the execution, it triggers the project closing, which is basically where we now bring the project to an end, and that's the last thing that occurs typically within the project management cycle. So like I mentioned earlier on, you can have a situation where project is broken down into stages, which is what you have here, and then the process groups are carried out within each of these stages. And if the stages of the project are managed one after the other, we said that the stages of the project have what we refer to as sequential relationship. So sequential relationship simply means that the project is the stages of the project are carried out one after the other. So we first of all finish phase 1 before we start phase 2. And then after we finish phase 2, then we start phase 3, depending on the number of phases of that particular project. So that's exactly what we have illustrated here. And then of course, beyond that, also notice that the 5 process groups interact within each of these phases. So we initiate, we plan, we execute, bring it to an end, and then do our phase gate as usual, and then of course go into the next stage until we've been able to deliver the project at the end of the day. So this is a typical example of what we refer to as sequential project. Now, aside from the sequential project, we can also have what we refer to as overlapping phases. So overlapping phases simply means that before a particular phase ends, another phase begins, and that's what we refer to as overlapping phases. Now, the overlapping phases is basically where we run 2 or more phases in parallel for some time. That's exactly what overlapping, refers to. Then we also have what we refer to as predictive life cycle, which is also known as the plan-driven approach. In the previous lesson, we made reference to the plan-driven approach. So the plan-driven approach is based on the gospel, or rather is predicated on the statement that if it doesn't work on paper, it will not work in real life. So the focus is how do we clearly identify and then plan out the project and then before we start implementation. So the plan-driven approach is used when the scope of the project is clear, and then also we can reasonably estimate the cost and the duration of the project in advance. This is when you use the predictive or a plan-driven approach. And then also the project is executed in a series of sequential or overlapping phases, and then there are what we refer to as suitable. This is suitable for large projects where most requirements are known at the beginning of the project, and each phase focuses on different activities and may require different skill set. So these are some of the reasons why you may want to adopt a predictive life cycle, or what we refer to as a plan-driven approach. Aside from that, there is now what we refer to as the iterative, or what we call the incremental life cycle. So this is basically a high-level objective. We said that the high-level objective may be defined upfront, but the details are defined in each iteration. So what this simply means is we do a high-level estimate. So we don't do a detailed planning like we do during the plan-driven or the predictive approach. So that's why we talk about a high-level objective may be set. And then, of course, during the iteration, this is now where we do a detailed definition. Iteration simply means that we are going to be delivering specific set of deliverables within a particular sprint, as the case is. Say, for example, we're developing a software that will enable people within our organization to communicate effectively. So, and we decide to use what we refer to as the iterative life cycle. So what we do is to gather the requirements from our resources or people who work within the organization. So during the requirements gathering process, all of the requirements we gather, we'll now prioritize those requirements based on which ones are the top priority requirements for our organization. So those ones that are top priority requirements for the organization can now be included in what we refer to as the very first iteration. So in essence, we're saying that by the time we are done with the first iteration, we are ready with the product, and the product will go live and then carry or contain some of those requirements. So don't forget, this is different from the predictive life cycle, because in predictive life cycle, we don't go live until all requirements have been met at the end of the very final phase. But in iteration, we simply go live once we have finish the very first iteration, which of course can be a 2 weeks iteration, or in some cases can be a 1 month iteration, depending on the speed that we choose to adopt. And then of course after that, the remaining set of requirements will now go into the next iteration, which is the second iteration. And then of course at the end of the second iteration, we infuse those other set of requirements, and then of course we update the product either to a version 2, depending on the amount of changes that was made, or maybe a version 1.1 if it was just a minor update, as the case may be. So the product is developed through a series of cycles. That's what we mentioned earlier on. So you do this, you come back again, you add specific features, and then you deploy, you come back again, and that's essentially what happens in the iteration. So that's also part of the reason why it's called incremental, because as we move from one iteration to the other, notice that features are being added incrementally on such a product, and that's part of the reason why this is used especially within the software cycle. Then we also have what we refer to as the adaptive or the agile approach. So these are also incremental as well as iterative, but then the iterations are much more rapid. So in essence, the adaptive or agile life cycle is also a form of the iterative life cycle. However, the speed of the release is now what makes it agile. So typically for agile projects, the range at which the iterations last usually is between 2 to 4 weeks. So in essence, iterations within an agile life cycle does not typically exceed 4 weeks, and then they are generally preferred when dealing with rapidly changing environment, like I mentioned earlier on, say for example the software industry, the technology industry, because as much as possible these industries actually change quite rapidly, and that's part of the reason why we use the adaptive life cycle within such industries. So far, so good. Remember in the very first lesson, we took a look at this particular table. And then in this table, we saw the 5 process groups, which is what you're seeing here, the 10 knowledge areas, which is also what you're seeing here. And then also we talked about the 49 processes, which is now all of these other aspects that you're seeing in this very slide. Now, not to worry, we're going to take a look at all of these one after the other in the course of the training, because after this very lesson, we're not going to be taking it one knowledge area after another, starting with integration up until the very last knowledge area, which is the project stakeholder management. But why? One thing is certain, part of the reason why I asked you to learn the 10 knowledge areas is the fact that it will help you to a large extent to be able to identify, and then also, if not for anything, develop this table yourself if you decide to come up with the table. Don't forget, a couple of questions in the exams, about 5 or 10 questions in the exam will usually ask you, a project manager has finished carrying out this particular process, what next should the project manager do? So during the initiating, there are only 2 processes, so that's probably not too much for you to remember at this point. Don't forget, the initiating, we develop the project charter, and then we identify the stakeholders. Those are the 2 processes that we normally carry out during the initiating of the project. Then during the planning of the project, this is where we now develop the project management plan. But then watch closely what happens here. If you notice, most of the processes that we have in the planning process group is a combination of the name of the process group and then the name of the knowledge area. For example, you have the plan scope, you have the plan schedule, the plan cost, plan quality, plan resource, plan communications, plan risk, plan procurement, and then plan stakeholder engagement. So you can see we're planning each of these knowledge areas. So in essence, if you know the knowledge areas, you already know that you plan all the knowledge areas, and that by extension means that you know additional 10 processes in addition to the 2 that are carried out during the initiating of the project. The integration knowledge area talks about the project in totality. If you remember when I was talking about integration, I told you this is the primary function of the project manager, because this is where the project manager combines all the other elements of the project in order to achieve the project objective. So that's part of the reason why, if you notice, integration doesn't use the word integrate. It keeps using the word project because it refers to the project in totality. Then also notice that what happened in the planning process group is also what was repeated in the monitoring and controlling process group. So you can see that as much as possible, we monitor and control each of these process groups. We monitor and control project, we control scope, we control schedule, we control cost, you control quality, you control resource, you monitor and control communications, you also monitor and control risk, you control procurement, and then you monitor and control stakeholder engagement. So if you remember this vividly, that you plan all the knowledge areas and then you monitor all the knowledge areas, that's an additional 20 processes, including the first 2 processes will now make it 22 processes in all. I mean, this is already a very good start. I mean, looking at it from that you're just in the second lesson of your PMP training. And then don't forget that closing has just 1 process. So that also will not be too much to remember. So if you remember that we have just 1 closing process, which is the close project or phase, it simply means that we're talking about 23 processes here already. So during the executing, notice that we don't execute in the triple constraint of scope, schedule, and cost. So there are no executing processes in scope, schedule, and cost. So where you have executing would now be the other knowledge areas. However, instead of we using the word execute, PMI mostly replaced it with the word manage, and that's why you're seeing manage project knowledge, manage project work, manage quality, manage team, manage communication, and then manage stakeholder engagement. The only exceptions are in risk, where instead of manage risk, it is now known as implement risk response, and then in procurement, where it is now referred to as conduct procurement. So if you remember the fact that you manage all knowledge areas except the scope, schedule, and cost, and then also the risk as well as procurement, then inadvertently to the 23 processes that you already know, you'll be adding an additional 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that will be 29 in all. Now, all the other processes that you're seeing here, we're going to figure them out one after the other in the course of this particular training. So if you want to be able to come up with this chart, it's pretty straightforward. First of all, write down the 5 process groups on the left and then the 10 knowledge areas at the top. And then, of course, once you've done that, write the 2 processes that you have during the initiating, which are the develop project charter and then the identify stakeholders. Then at the top of each of these, just write plan. And then after you've written plan, simply add the name of the knowledge areas to the plan. So for example, plan scope, plan schedule, plan cost, plan quality. And then when it comes to project, when it comes to integration, instead of using integration, remember we said replace it with project. So do the same thing again for monitoring and controlling. So typically what you're now going to do there is simply write control, and then of course use the word monitor for communication, risk, as well as stakeholders. So once you've written control across board, then again begin to add the name of these other knowledge areas one after the other. Then don't forget, in closing, there's only 1 process there, which is the close project or phase. We don't execute in scope, schedule, and cost. So leave out those three places. Then in the other, simply write manage, 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 and then of course for risk, put implement, and then conduct for procurement. Then the others will now be managed. Again, begin to add, the name of the process of the knowledge areas. Which here will now have manage quality, and then under resource, it is now known as manage team. Then communication is now manage communications, and then stakeholders is manage stakeholder engagement. So once you've been able to do that, then the next thing will now be for you to begin to add these other processes, which of course you would learn accordingly as we journey along when we begin to talk about each of these knowledge areas as well as the processes that we have in them. So remember, like we said, that there are 5 process groups, there are 10 knowledge areas, and then also the 49 processes. Now, one key thing again you would notice that integration is the only knowledge area where you have the processes in it cutting across the 5 process groups. So if you notice, the processes we have under integration, they cut across the 5 process groups. Who can tell me why? Of course, the reason is pretty straightforward, because integration talks about the project in totality. So that's why we perform all the processes in across the process groups under integration. So integration is basically where we combine every other thing. So every other knowledge area talks about specific aspects of the project. For example, the scope of the project, the schedule, the cost, the quality, the resource, the communication, the risk, the procurement, as well as the stakeholders. So you notice that usually you cannot, have a situation where the processes in them cuts across the 5 process groups. And then, like we mentioned earlier on, there are 2 processes that we do during the initiating, which are the develop project charter as well as the identify stakeholders. So to enable us now talk about the processes one after the other, we now need to define what a process is. So PMI talks about a process as a distinct set of activities that is triggered by input, undergoes transformation using tools and techniques, and then produces an output. So in a nutshell, a process simply means ITTO. In other words, it is triggered by input, then undergoes transformation using tools and techniques, and then produces an output. Say, for example, we want to bake a cake. So if we want to bake a cake, notice that cake baking would typically go through certain processes. Say, for example, we have the mixing process, and then we have the baking process, and we have the icing process. Let's assume that these are the 3 processes that we have in baking. So if we take them one after the other, beginning with the mixing process, you will notice that there were things that we need to mix. So those things that go into the mixing that we need to mix, those ingredients that we need to mix, that's what we refer to as the input. So in this case, they would include, of course, the flour. Then also you talk about, I'm not so much into baking, so I might really not know these details. But I know that, there could be some other things like your baking powder, and then also usually there is egg, and then there could also be some preservatives, as the case may be, depending on exactly the type of cake we're baking. So all of these items are now what we refer to as input in the baking process. Now, to enable us mix this input in the mixing process, so to enable us mix these items, we now require help of certain items or certain utensils. For example, we need a mixer, or probably would also be needing a spatula, or we're going to need a spoon or a bowl or a whisk. Or all of these things are part of what we now refer to as tools. So that's why they are called tools. And then the mixing can take different approaches. It's either we go clockwise or anti-clockwise. We can do it manually, or we do it with an automated machine. All of these are what we refer to as techniques. So techniques simply refers to various approaches or various ways that we can actually carry out a particular process. So at the end of the day, these tools and techniques will transform the input, like I mentioned earlier on, and then of course you will now get an output. The output we are going to get at the end of the mixing process would be a batter. So the butter would now form an input in the baking process. And then, of course, part of the tools will now include the baking pan, the oven, and then, of course, part of the techniques will now include the way we choose to bake. There are some people who actually bake with the oven, some do it with the microwave, and then also some even do it with the cooker, as the case may be. So all of these various approaches are what we refer to as the techniques. So at the end of the baking process, what will be the output? Cake will be the output. Now the cake will now form input in the icing process. So you can see how we've been able to demonstrate the ITTOs, that's the input, tools and techniques and output, in order to be able to define what we mean by process. Going back to our earlier definition where we said that process simply refers to distinct set of activities that is triggered by input, undergoes transformation using tools and techniques, and then produces an output. And that's exactly what the process refers to. So notice that for all our 49 processes, remember we mentioned the fact that in PMP we have 49 processes. So for all our 49 processes, they will all have input, tools and techniques as well as output. And that's exactly what the ITTO represents. So simply imagine that these processes you're seeing here represents the 49 processes we have in PMP, and that we have demonstrated that each of these would have ITTO, that's the input, the tools and techniques and the output. Same also the 49 processes would also have the input, the tools and the techniques as well as the output. However, there is now what we refer to as common input. So the common inputs you're going to be seeing repeatedly in all your 49 processes would include your enterprise environmental factors. So enterprise environmental factor simply refers to anything that affects your project. For example, culture, organization. All of these things are part of what we refer to as the enterprise environmental factors. Then also we have the organizational process asset. It simply refers to anything that can help in the planning as well as implementation of your project. For example, previous plans, documents, analytical data, policies. All of these refers to as the organizational process asset. So you're going to see both the enterprise environmental factors as well as the organizational process assets as part of the input in most of the 49 processes. Then also your project management plan as well as your work performance data. All of these will also be constant input. So you're going to see them repeatedly, common input. You're going to see them repeatedly as we show each of those 49 processes. There are also common tools and techniques, which are also tools and techniques you're also going to see repeatedly. They would include expert judgment. Expert judgment simply means opinion of a subject matter expert. So you're going to also see this repeatedly as we journey along. Then also your data gathering and representation techniques, data analysis, as well as meeting and facilitation. These are common tools and techniques that you would see in most of the 49 processes. So here we took a look at what we refer to as process. We said that process simply refers to distinct set of activities triggered by input, undergoes transformation using tools and techniques, and then produces output. And then of course we said that input simply refers to things that go into the performance of the process, while output is the result we get at the end of the performance of the process. The tools and the techniques are the transforming agents, which of course leads to the output. Then also don't forget that we said that we have the 10 knowledge areas, which we refer to as the core creeps, and that is of course the initiating, planning, executing, that is of course the integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communication, risk, procurement, and stakeholders. And then we talked about expert judgment. This is basically this opinion of a subject matter expert. We also talked about organizational process assets, so include things that can aid us in the course of planning for our project. Then of course work performance information refers to data that has been processed and has been interpreted or compared against a certain baseline to give us a meaning. Then enterprise environmental factors are factors that are not within our control. And then then also the project management plan is now a guide that serves for the project implementation. We also talked about the 5 process groups, which includes the initiating, where we basically talk about activities that we carry out to start the project, and then the planning, where we'll talk about how we are going to do the project, and then also when we're going to do the project, and then also how much the project is going to cost. And then we talked about executing, which talks about the doing aspect of the project. In monitoring and controlling, this is where we now check the project implementation, and then of course during the closing process is essentially where we bring the project to an end. So this is also where we come to the end of our lesson 2. Part 2 of this particular series. I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. In the next lesson, which is lesson 3, we're going to now start looking at the knowledge areas one after the other, starting with the project integration management. And that's the very first knowledge area that we shall take a look at. I hope this particular video has been very informative for you. Once again, thank you for listening, and see you in the next lesson.